much. I'm delighted to be here with you today. Thanks very much for inviting me. It's only recently that I joined the Prayer Book Society, and I don't really know why it's only recently, because I grew up with the prayer book and it's sort of in my bones. Singing in my local church choir in the 1960s and the 70s, when matins and evensong were still the staple, it could hardly be otherwise, even though as choir boys, I can't honestly say we paid all that much attention to the text. We were allowed to smuggle in war comics to read during the sermons, but something of the language just stayed with me, and it's become, as I say, something that's in my bones. For me, the prayer book is not a museum piece, but a living liturgy. The text, of course, for which much of the great music of the Anglican choral tradition was written, and it's still my default for daily prayer when I'm travelling to do a lot and away from home. But I'm not a prayer book fundamentalist. I would probably identify myself as a prayer book Catholic, in the sense that Rowan Williams uses in the latest edition of Faith and Worship. For us, we'll see there's no getting round the fact that the prayer book ceased to be a viable vehicle on its own for swathes of Anglicanism in the relatively recent past. One of the churches in which I serve regularly is known to be a prayer book church, but even there we don't celebrate the Lord's Supper, and we don't call it the Lord's Supper, completely in the way Cranmer envisaged. Apart from having eastward-facing celebration and Eucharistic vestments, we make small adjustments, even to the text itself, to accommodate an elderly and frail congregation. No meekly kneeling upon your knees, I'm afraid. But all liturgy adjusts, even as it stays, or seems to stay, much the same. I remember very well the conflicts that ensued at parish level from the introduction of Series 1, 2 and 3, and then of the alternative service book. One could not live through ordinary parish life over the last 60 or more years and not be aware of the gradual marginalisation of the book by which our church-going ancestors lived and prayed for centuries. But this marginalisation and the accompanying modification of the Book of Common Prayer is not simply the consequence of a largely futile chasing of fashion and relevance in the face of catastrophic decline, as we're sometimes tempted to think. In this, as in so many things, we are really children of the Victorians. It was in the 19th century that the ground shifted under and within the Church of England, and the prayer book lost the capacity to cater adequately for the whole range of Anglican opinion. And this was not so much in response to decline, but to growth, to expansion and reform. To church historians, what I'm going to say is hardly unfamiliar territory. I make no claim to present today a new perspective or new research even, but rather I just want to explore once again a familiar story, and I hope connect it imaginatively with our present predicaments. For at the centre of this story, of course, is the man we commemorate today, Thomas Cranmer himself, for all his failings. And in this story we see a sometimes subtle, sometimes not so subtle shift in the significance accorded to Cranmer's legacy. In summary, what we see occurring in the 19th century is, ironically, given all I've said about the marginalisation of the Book of Common Prayer, an even greater marginalisation of Cranmer himself. The book, for all its apparent limitations, retained a more central, more vital significance for modern Anglicanism than the man himself. At the outset of the 19th century, Without question, the one literary work above all, apart from the prayer book itself, which dominated the popular picture of Cranmer was John Foxe's Book of Martyrs, which, along with Pilgrim's Progress and some rather less salubrious publications such as Old Moore's Almanac, remained a staple of the English labourer's admittedly limited reading. Foxe's book, which remained in print throughout the 19th century, imprinted the image of a timid man who, at the last, found in his faith the resolve to face death with equanimity, famously thrusting his right hand, which had signed the recantations, into the flames, where he held it, Foxe says, steadfast and immovable. But Foxe's summary is perhaps of most interest to us, however. And thus you have the full story concerning the life and death of this Reverend Archbishop and martyr of God, Thomas Cranmer, the last of the learned sort burnt by Mary, being burnt about the very middle time of the reign of that queen, and almost the very middle man of all the martyrs which were burned in all her reign besides. Martyr and middleman, i.e. moderate. That might be a suitable summary placing of Cranmer's reputation with most Anglicans at the beginning of the century. Foxe's picture was, for most churchmen, supported by the authorities of John Strype, whom Fergus quoted, of course, at the site of the burning. John Strype described Cranmer as deserving best of any archbishop before him, and to whose solid learning, deliberation, and indefatigable pains both the kings and people of this realm owe their deliverance from the long and cruel bondage of Rome. And alongside Strype, for the 18th century and into the early 19th century, the other great authority was Gilbert Burnet. At the same time, the prominence, indeed ubiquity, of the prayer book in parish worship was obvious to behold. There's general agreement now amongst historians that the idea that parish worship was in sharp decline in the 18th century, with services frequently neglected or poorly celebrated, has been much exaggerated, not least by the Victorians themselves, who plainly contrasted waves of revival in their time, which I'm going to speak shortly, with the laxity of an earlier period. But, as the historian and churchman Bill Jacob has argued, what evidence there is, on the contrary, suggests that the church, he says, managed to compete satisfactorily for the allegiance of the English and Welsh populations, and the laity demanded regular provision of services. Another historian, Jeremy Gregory, has argued that the prayer book was central to social life in the 18th century at all levels of society, and where there were unauthorized additions or adaptations, these did not fundamentally affect its overall agreed status. Even the Methodist movement, which in one sense was plainly a rebellion of sorts against the static character of parish Anglicanism, was actually a revival movement intended to strengthen the pastoral provision of the church. And the Wesleys themselves placed the highest valuation on the prayer book. John Wesley said of it famously, "There is no liturgy in the world, either in ancient or modern language, which breathes more of a solid, scriptural, rational piety." Although he eventually approved a revision of it for Methodist use, for generations, Methodist worship was substantially based on the prayer book. All this is not to say that the 18th century was a golden age of prayer book worship, or even of parish Anglicanism. But it was nonetheless a time of, on the whole, broad Anglican agreement about the status and adequacy of the prayer book. So how and why did all this change? Remember, it's primarily the status of the prayer book itself on which I want to concentrate today. But two authors radically different in religious views and rhetorical aims represent first the shaking of Cranmer's reputation as a martyr and middleman of faith, as John Strype called him. One is John Lingard, the Catholic historian, some would say the first English Catholic historian of the Reformation of real merit. It's no surprise that in his History of England, first published in 1819, Lingard treats Cranmer with quiet disdain, highlighting his concealed second marriage, his subservience to Henry, and his duplicity over his oath to the Pope, which was apparently repudiated by a prior commitment with witnesses present to ignore its force. Lingard comments, "Oaths cease to offer any security if their meanings may be qualified by previous protestations." It's a quote that drips with scorn, I think. In a society still charged with pervasive anti-Catholic prejudice, this was really throwing down the gauntlet, and several champions naturally entered the lists in Cranmer's defence, including a brace of Anglican clerics and the poet Robert Southey. Now, Southey, his youthful radicalism, long faded, caught something of the ambiguity of Cranmer well, I think, when he contrasted him with Thomas Cromwell. And Southey's picture of Cromwell was, for its time, very sympathetic. And he said of Cranmer that he was a meek, unworldly spirit, courageous only when the strong sense of duty enabled him to overcome his natural temper. But it's not Southey I want to take as the other symbolic author, but William Cobbett, radical, rural, Tory of a kind, and also Anglican of a rather idiosyncratic form. Cobbett was profoundly influenced by Lingard's work. It played into his conviction that the English peasantry had been dispossessed of their lands and rights by generations of grasping gentry and aristocracy. Cobbett's work, which was immensely popular, something like 700,000 copies of his History of the Reformation were sold, his work came just a few years after a really notorious book called by a radical critic called John Wade, the Extraordinary Black Book, which had catalogued the alleged corruption and bloated wealth of the established church. So Cobbett was really building on a tradition that was beginning to become well established of criticism of Anglicanism from that side of things. The dissolution of the monasteries, in particular for Cobbett, had been state-sponsored theft, robbing the poor of the institutions that had supported them, and Cranmer had his sticky fingers all over it. Cobbett called him a cold-blooded, most perfidious, most impious, most blasphemous caitiff, whose life expired at last amidst the flames which he himself had been the chief cause of kindling. And indeed, Cobbett called Fox's Book of Martyrs Lying Fox's lying book of Protestant martyrs. For Cobbett, Cranmer had a key role in the establishment of the English Reformation. His Book of Common Prayer after the old king's death, Cobbett said, backed by foreign bayonets and imposed triumphantly on the country. So Cobbett, the radical, Lingard, the Catholic, these are very odd names to yoke together. At a push, and this is pushing it, you could say they represented two growing streams of dissent from the general acceptance of the reputation of Cranmer and his liturgy. And I'm, for the sake of the brevity and so on in this lecture, I'm just leaving to one side what's called old dissent, i.e. the Congregationalists, Independents, Baptists, etc., who clearly had always had difficulties with the 1662 text. Now, clearly the English Catholic community had no reason to estimate either Cranmer or his liturgy highly, so Lingard's stance is hardly surprising. but the relatively quiescent, recusant English Catholic families were by this time beginning to give way to something much more militant and ascendant. It's not part of my story today to look at the growth of the Catholic Church in England in the 19th century, but the stronger it grew, the louder sounded its criticisms of Anglican history and Anglican worship. Lingard's history appeared just a few years before Catholic emancipation. It's a matter of some irony that the Catholic Church, for all its difficulties with establishment Anglicanism and its association later in the century with some progressive causes, on a number of key issues, including education, in the end proved itself to be no enemy of religious establishments in general. For Cobbett, on the other hand, the radical critique which he advanced represented just the starting point of a growing chorus of criticism of the Church and of the state and the social and political elite, which was to have its strongest roots in the new industrial towns of the Midlands and the North, not the countryside beloved of Cobbett. And that radical critique was to overlap with the growing force of Protestant dissent. Lingard and Cobbett stand for the growing religious and political pluralism of British society in the 19th century. That, ultimately, was to knock prayer book Anglicanism from its perch. Now, where might the defence of Cranmer himself have come from? In the early 19th century and into the early years of Victoria's reign, there was no shortage of traditional high churchmen prepared to defend his liturgical legacy and even the man himself. Here I'll take another symbolic figure, Walter Hooke. Hooke was a reforming vicar of Leeds and later Dean of Chichester, an ardent high churchman who allied himself with the Oxford movement at first, reeled away in horror at its Romeward drift, and gradually drifted back as a cautious supporter of Pusey after Newman's conversion in 1845. Hooke, it has to be said, was no subtle intellectual. He was plainly spoken, sturdy and clear in his judgments, and sometimes resilient in his prejudices. Unlike many of his high church contemporaries who relished touring the continent, Hooke rarely travelled. He wrote back from an apparently unique trip to Paris, "I am heartily sick of Paris, hate France, and think Frenchmen the most detestable of human beings. In 3 weeks I hope to be in dear old England, and never shall I wish again to quit her shores." That gives you a sense of the man. In his lecture on 3 Reformations, Hooke declared that he was no admirer of Cranmer, though God had used him as an instrument of good to the Church of England. He was a weak, worldly, vacillating man, the flatterer of a tyrant. Much the same picture, if a little bit more nuanced, emerged in his quite long section on Cranmer in his later Lives of the Archbishops of Canterbury. Hooke admitted that there was much indefensible in Cranmer's behaviour and that he had not, quote, "this manliness of character to say to the king when offered the see of Canterbury that he could not take it because he had a wife." For Hooke, though, Cranmer was still a middle man, neither a papist nor a Protestant, but professing to be a Catholic. Hooke believed that even after the death of Henry and of Cranmer's behaviour into the reign of Edward. And for Hooke, he was preeminent, he said, as a writer of pure English. So for Hooke, in the end, it was the liturgy which secured Cranmer's worth. For the blessing which we possess in our liturgy, he said, we are indebted to that intuitive wisdom of the English mind, which objects to changes for the mere sake of changing, and which, while sanctioning reform, abhors revolution. So here we have, in the rather rough hands of Walter Hooke, a crucial distinction emerging in the Victorian view of Cranmer, between the now faint praise for the man and yet the high appreciation for his masterpiece, the Book of Common Prayer. And that, in a nutshell, was the mid, and for many Anglicans, even the late Victorian High Church view. But it was not to last. The seeds of its dissolution lay in the growing theological conflict in the Church of England, the emergence by the 1850s of three clearly identifiable church parties, high, broad, and low, which had different attitudes towards the Reformation, different ideas of the church and its ministry, and even different ideas of biblical revelation and church tradition. They were the consequence of a running conflict evoked originally by the reforms of the 1820s and 30s, by which the Church of England lost much of its privileged constitutional position and faced the challenge of non-Anglican members of Parliament legislating on church matters. Here, the Oxford movement was pivotal. Now, it began when? Newman reckoned it began in 1833, with Keeble's assize sermon here in this church, provoked by the Whig government's reform of the Irish Church. But as the Catholic scholar Peter Knuckles has shown, there's a case for pushing it further back into the fight against Catholic emancipation in Oxford in the late 1820s. Now, study of the Oxford movement has suffered from the almost inevitable contraction of its scope to the dramatic life of Newman himself, and then the circle around him of Keble, Pusey, and Harold Froude. But of course it was always a much larger and wider movement, and in some ways even the very term Oxford movement is misleading, for Keble was not based in Oxford for any of this period, and Froude was ill, out of Oxford, and then dead, so that only Pusey and Newman themselves were truly of Oxford in the 1830s and 40s. And many of their friends and supporters were elsewhere in parishes up and down the country. And at first, with a deliberate appeal to as large a basis of church support as possible, the divisive nature of the movement was masked by its emphasis on traditional Anglican values and on the need to defend the church against the threat of reform forced on it by the state. Here, then, the Reformation was a good, if a rather blemished good. The preservation of the Anglican settlement as a middle way, matching the very idea that Cranmer was a middleman, was a providential outcome of what in fact was a messy and incomplete process. From the very beginning, though, the Oxford movement was marked by a paradox when it came to Cranmer and his work. Quite quickly, the more critical views of the reformers began to predominate. The symbolic moment here was the publication in 1838 of Harold Froude's literary remains, so were called, by Keble and Newman. For that shocked contemporaries with Froude's description, of course originally in private correspondence, which was published after his death, of the Reformation as a limb badly set. Froude plainly disliked what he read of the character of the reformers, and that mattered to him because impure motives could not, in his view, produce satisfactory outcomes. The sincerity of the leading men on both sides seems so equivocal, he wrote, that I can hardly see what attached them to their respective positions. Naturally, this kind of language confirmed the fears of many Anglicans that Tractarianism led to popery, and it provoked ridicule and counter-mobilization, of which perhaps the most visible and lasting evidence is the Martyrs' Memorial in St. Giles, where many of us were earlier. As this war over how to interpret the Reformation grew in intensity, the other side of the paradox stood out ever more sharply in contrast. Whatever their views of Cranmer himself, the Tractarians considered the prayer book to weigh on their side as a liturgy redolent of the Catholic past and patient of reading and use, as an expression of Catholic doctrine. From almost the beginning of the tracts, Newman defended it strongly, resisting arguments for its reform. In Tract 38, which is on the Via Media, Newman asserted that Tractarian principles were the true principles of the Reformation. It's astonishing claim, if you think about it, and had been set aside in the present day by those who had abandoned aspects of the prayer book services. And he said, "What is the prevailing opinion or usage respecting the form of absolution in the office for visiting the sick? What is thought by a great body of men of the words in which the priesthood is conveyed? Are there no objections to the Athanasian Creed? No murmurs against the commination service? Does no one stumble at the word oblations in the prayer for the church militant? Is there no clamour against parts of the burial service? No secret or scarcely secret complaints against the word regeneration in the baptismal? No bold protestations against reading the Apocrypha? Now do not all these objections," so in other words, he's listing the things that he knows that many, particularly evangelicals, might have objected to in the prayer book. "Do not all these objections rest upon one general ground, namely that these parts of our services," to the critics as it were, "savour of popery?" Newman's mind moved fast, however. It was a short step from there to his famous assertion 2 years later in his lectures on the prophetical office of the church, originally delivered, I think, in the room where we had lunch, that the Tractarian or Anglican view of the church was but a paper theory, yet to be fully realised. And then again, it was a short step from there on to the notorious description in Tract 90, the last of the tracts, of the stammering lips of ambiguous formularies, within which Catholic truth might be discerned. You see, Newman's view moved very quickly towards a much more critical view of the prayer book. By then, Newman was done with the prayer book as well as the articles. And actually, it's interesting that when you look at what he says about Anglican worship after his conversion, there's a tremendous amount of yearning for his life in Oxford, which he clearly missed enormously. But there very clearly no sense of missing Anglican worship. It, for him, was something that he had no regrets about leaving at all. But Newman was mostly alone in this trajectory, at least at this point. Early pressure for reform of the liturgy in practice came mostly from evangelicals who wished to see the prayer book made more adaptable, more user-friendly in our terms, with shorter services and greater latitude for the inclusion of hymns and even informal prayers. And the Tractarian defence of the prayer book did not go unnoticed by their theological opponents. One strong evangelical critic claimed that the principle, the essential element of a mediatorial priesthood must be eradicated from the church, and especially from the prayer book, that grand practical exponent of every churchman's, i.e. Tractarian's, creed. Sacerdotalism is a fundamental heresy, having its origin in the deepest recesses of our corrupt nature. Extraordinarily extreme language, but from an evangelical critic of the prayer book. To this, we must add the furore which followed Bishop Philpotts of Exeter's refusal to institute an evangelical G.C. Gorham to the living of Bramford Speke in Devon, on the grounds he did not appear to accept the prayer book doctrine of baptismal regeneration. Whatever else that controversy achieved, and it prompted a flurry of conversions to Rome, including that of Henry Manning, it proved Newman's point. The formularies were indeed ambiguous, at least in the terms of theological dispute mid-century. Evangelicals were waking up to the possibility that the prayer book was not necessarily an unalloyed blessing, just as Anglo-Catholics were beginning to find their own views only half supported in the liturgy. The prayer book's formerly uncontested status was increasingly open to dispute. If the reputation of Cranmer the man was already much in question, so now was his greatest legacy to the Church of England. Now, if we have to look anywhere for an unconditional defence of the prayer book by the 1850s, 1860s, theological warts and all, that is, we can find it in, of all places, the so-called Broad Church, or at least in its greatest theological champion, F.D. Maurice. Now, Maurice always denied he was Broad Church, but his peculiar combination of biblical theology, high church sacramentalism, and quasi-Platonic metaphysics placed him uncertainly somewhere between evangelicalism, especially what he called popular Protestantism, and Tractarianism. So he is somewhere in the middle. If we judge someone by their friends, then it's no surprise that Maurice's greatest supporters were broad churchmen, including Charles Kingsley, Julius Hare, Archbishop Tate, and Dean Stanley. Maurice supplied one of the most unusual defences of the prayer book in Anglican history, effectively assimilating it to his own theology of the kingdom of Christ and of the church uniting all disparate human sects. The prayer book, he said, was the answer to church division. It articulated for the nation a theology encompassing the best insights of all parties. What Englishmen chiefly want, he said, is a clear recognition that the spiritual is also the practical, that it belongs not more to the temple than to the counting house and the workshop. This the reformers provided. I claim the prayer book and articles both as the protection for those who repudiate the parties into which our church is divided from their common assaults. Maurice actually had very little to say about Cranmer himself, in whom he seems to have shown very little interest. What Maurice was articulating, though often in painfully strained prose, was the conviction that for all its faults, such as they were, Cranmer's prayer book expressed the religious aspirations of a national community which transcended its own internal divisions. For him, liturgy was of a piece with ideas of national character, certainly of social cohesion, and even of national destiny. This view persisted well into the 20th century, perhaps even up to the present, in some circles, as characteristic of a central Anglicanism, liberal in outlook, social in its theology, which dutifully avoided liturgical innovation and theological reform. It was in large measure the position of, for example, William Temple. But since it made no substantial arguments for prayer book reform, I can happily now leave it to one side for what remains of my lecture. Having seen that evangelicals tended to be the early advocates, at least of modest reform of the liturgy, and that high churchmen, including Tractarians, were largely defenders of it, what needs to be explained is how, by the end of this century, this position had been largely reversed. For the main impetus for liturgical reform in the end was to come from Anglo-Catholics, and the decisive turning point was to take place just into the 20th century. From the Anglo-Catholic side, we can see two interlocking processes at work. The first was the expansion of liturgical scholarship, including close study of the medieval English liturgy and of the sources on which Cranmer drew. Now, there were plenty of precedents, and in Newman's student days, Charles Lloyd, Regius Professor and later Bishop of Oxford, ran private classes in which he discussed the antecedents of the prayer book. Attenders included Newman himself, of course, Hurrell-Froude and Pusey. But of the new current of work, stimulated by the Oxford movement, two books stand out. William Palmer's Origines Liturgicae, Liturgical Origins in 1832 was a study of early church liturgies and of their connection to various elements of the prayer book. Palmer's goal was to counter the idea that, to quote, English liturgy retains nothing of the primitive liturgies except the preface and words of our Redeemer. This was the patristic argument of Tractarianism applied to the Book of Common Prayer, and Palmer was looking rather to leap over the medieval church to get back to the prayer book's primitive origins. In a nutshell, that was both the strength and weakness of Palmer's approach. Avoid medievalism, emphasize antiquity. And it perhaps assumed rather more knowledge of the early church on the part of Cranmer than may be really warranted. Some years later, a somewhat renegade Tractarian, shortly to convert to Rome, William Maskell, published a massive examination of the English medieval rites. It's quite a tongue twister. I'll try and say this without tripping over it. Monumenta Ritualia Ecclesiae Anglicanae, monuments of the ritual of the English Church, in 1846, subtitled tellingly, Occasional Offices of the Church of England according to the ancient use of Salisbury. Maskell's goal, in other words, was to do precisely the opposite of William Palmer, whom he found disappointing for his failure to note the relevance of the Sarum use. Now, these authors perhaps anticipate the split in Anglo-Catholicism later in the century between prayer book and Roman elements. But for the moment, their work, and that of others, was taken up by a host of popularizers who produced devotional and ritual works embellishing the prayer book for practical Anglo-Catholic use. Preeminent was John Purchas and Frederick Lee's Directorium Anglicanum, Anglican Directions, first published in 1858 and reprinted frequently thereafter. This was in its day a shocking text, which sought to add the whole range of Western Catholic ritual and ceremonial to the prayer book's communion service, rather like plastering a wedding cake over a plain plum pudding. Here are the opening words of the text itself. The celebration of the Holy Eucharist is the principal act of Christian worship, inasmuch as it calls directly into action the office of our great high priest, not only to present our prayers to the Father, but to plead anew the merits of his own adorable sacrifice. It should therefore have all possible dignity imparted to it by a carefully observed ritual. Cranmer, who is barely mentioned in his book, would have been spinning in his grave. And it's this text, and others like it, which mandated the ritual conflict into which the Church of England was plunged in the second half of the 19th century, the second of these interlocking processes by which Anglo-Catholicism's view of the prayer book changed. The conflict came to a head in the wake of the Public Worship Regulation Act of 1874, promoted by the evangelical Lord Shaftesbury, reluctantly accepted by Archbishop Tate, and passed by Disraeli's government. The Tractarian Gladstone would never have countenanced it. It led to the prosecution and imprisonment of a number of ritualist priests and thereby turned public opinion against it, though it's a moot point, at least an unproven one, whether there was ever really serious popular support for the act in the first place. Ritualism, though, was not the only sign that Anglo-Catholics were becoming dissatisfied with the plain fare of the prayer book and what is something richer and, dare I say it, spicier and continental. Anglo-Catholics frequently looked across the Channel for inspiration, particularly to the French Church, for new approaches to mission, to penitential discipline, to preaching and to ceremonial. Continental travel played an important part in this process. Many Anglican clergy, particularly rich clergy, were avid travellers in the 19th century. They'd spend actually often up to 2 or 3 months of the summer travelling on the continent, get a curate to cover for you and go away for long periods on holiday, enthusiastically noting what they observed in foreign churches, often with approval. Now, you can't argue that all this represented a flight as such from the prayer book, which remained largely enforced and mostly in use, but it did put Cranmer's text, to say nothing of the intended theology of it, increasingly in a beleaguered place. So, apart from those broad church, national church Anglicans I mentioned, who else was defending the prayer book by this time, by the 1870s and 1880s? Well, ironically, given their earlier position, it was essentially the evangelicals. They'd achieved, by the last quarter of the century, a measure of modest reform. Ritual controversy had led to the appointment of a royal commission on ritual. Can you imagine that happening now? In 1867. And from its various recommendations came some reform of the lectionary, leading to shorter services through the abbreviation of Old Testament readings in particular, and then through what eventually became the Act of Uniformity Amendment Act, a series of minor changes which included shortened forms of morning and evening prayer for use during the week, latitude for bishops to approve the use of extracts from the prayer book on certain occasions, preaching outside prayer book provision, and a third service on Sundays. The text of the prayer book itself was not modified, however. Now, this provision effectively worked well for those clergy who wanted some additional support for services in rapidly growing areas and in mission churches. There were many of these in the late 19th century, these mission churches, many of them tin tabernacles, the corrugated iron temporary chapels that you could buy from church furnishing catalogues. Beyond this moderate reform, there was no evangelical demand for substantial change. So here is one more figure as a symbol. Handley Moule, theologian, first principal of Ridley Hall, and later Bishop Westcott's successor as Bishop of Durham. Moule perfectly encapsulated the moderate evangelical attitude to the prayer book in his letter to my younger brethren, was published in 1892, in a chapter entitled, "The Prayer Book Not Perfect, but Inestimable." He quoted a friend who had said to him, "The prayer book is always handy to throw at people's heads." Figuratively, of course, not literally. And Moule went on, "He slung it out in various quotations from his pulpit, point blank at the unreality and formalism and Pharisaism and love of this present evil world, which too often underlies the most precise churchmanship and the most punctual church-going." That's a veiled attack on Anglo-Catholics. But Moule also said that if a temperate and equitable revision were possible at the present time, I should welcome the prospect on most accounts. But it seems to me plain that it is not at present possible. And meanwhile, I thank God from my inmost heart for the actual prayer book as a whole. Now, that might seem an underwhelming endorsement, but in the fractious context of contemporary Anglican politics, it was saying quite a lot. And it perhaps signalled how, nearly 30 years later, in the agitation around the revised prayer book in the 1920s and its rejection by Parliament, evangelicals were able to make common cause with some broad or central Anglicans against revision. So what was the end of all of this? We've seen Cranmer himself praised, abused, and finally to some extent ignored by Victorian clergy as one of the most prominent of the Church of England's reformers. And we have seen his greatest legacy, the Book of Common Prayer, journey from general approval and acceptance through growing controversy to the beginning of liturgical reform. Unquestionably, the internal diversification of Anglicanism underpinned this process. But many external pressures impinged too. I began with Lingard, the Catholic historian. The Catholic Church's definitive judgment on Cranmer's work came in 1896, with condemnation of Anglican orders by Leo XIII's bull Apostolicae Curiae. It made no mention of Cranmer by name. He had just fallen out of the picture altogether. but it did savage the Anglican ordinal, Cranmer's work, as deficient in form and in intention. Catholic resurgence in modern Britain, paralleled by the growth of other Christian denominations and by the early signs of that long-term decline in general religious culture and affiliation which affects us even today, placed the prayer book itself and Anglican worship and life in general in a very different context by the end of the century from that of 1800. And more was to come. It was a renewed focus on the controversial nature of ritualism, which led to the establishment of a new royal commission on rituals, actually called On Ecclesiastical Discipline, which reported in 1906 and concluded that, as it said, the law of public worship in the Church of England is too narrow for the religious life of this present generation. Not just ritualism per se, but the ecclesiological plurality of the Church of England had become embedded so deeply in parish life that it was evident that no common standard of liturgical practice could be enforced any longer. That was the beginning of the long process of prayer book revision, which consumed the Church of England in the 1920s, rather like living in love and faith consumes us today, and eventually led to those parish conflicts I witnessed as a boy in South London in the 1960s and 1970s. When we stand back from this very English story, of course, other shapes and forms begin to emerge from the shadows. I have said nothing of the growth of Anglicanism overseas and the eventual strains which that put on the prayer book, beginning in America in the 1770s and 1780s. Still, to me, always a bit of a shock if I ever experienced the older American liturgy to find yourself responding to, "O Lord, save the state." Going on to the effective abandonment of the royal supremacy in territories of the empire and emerging in the demand for indigenous liturgies. I've said nothing of the growth of historical scholarship in this period, with the opening up and publication of new sources which began to transform our understanding of the Reformation, leading eventually to new or more sophisticated views of Cranmer and his contemporaries, and by a long streak, of course, up to the present, eventually led to things like Dermot McCulloch's marvellous biography of Cranmer. Nor have I done more than hint at the way in which even the Church of England's experience of a growing separation, even conflict between church and state in the 19th century, echoed developments on the continent. This was, after all, a great period of what some historians have described as state-making, when the consolidation of the power and authority of the nation-state inevitably involved intensifying conflict between secular authority and Europe's older religious establishments. I've always been struck by the seeming coincidence, it's something more than that, I think, of ritual conflict and suppression in England, the Kulturkampf in Imperial Germany, and the church-state conflict in the French Third Republic. Here and elsewhere, older liturgies frequently found themselves appropriated as weapons, or perhaps better, buttresses, against so-called modernizing pressures. Now, I said at the beginning that I thought the prayer book was still a living liturgy. It is still, after all, a liturgy in use. And I suppose most of us who do use it, to some extent, read into it theological emphases and principles which Cranmer himself may very well not have held. After all, the vision of a reformed, godly society which inspired Cranmer, and which his uniform liturgy for regular daily use by people and clergy alike was intended to create, that has passed away. As we see the disappearance of the sacred canopy which Christianity once supplied for our society, in its place come a host of values and positions which jostle against each other and contradict each other. And that makes common prayer something of a challenge. In this, the Church of England naturally is not insulated from wider social processes. But we can hardly blame Cranmer for that. It's perhaps remarkable that a prayer book written from the very heart of the Reformation disputes should still captivate so many, despite everything. After all, as I hope I have shown, the history of its displacement goes back long before the formation of this society in 1972, back into a period of astonishing church renewal and growth. Thank you very much.